Hello everyone and welcome to another video. So this is a follow-up video of the previous video. In the previous video, I demonstrated on how to query Azure AI Search Knowledge Base with OneLake Fabric unstructured data as a source. So I posted the link to that video in this video's description. The limitation with this approach was that all the user queries had to be entered through the Azure portal. Right, so let me quickly recap on how the Azure AI search was implemented in the previous video. So this is our unstructured data source on Fabric OneLake. So we had two files that were non-fictional stories. Let me quickly open those files. So one of the files was the door in the wall and other stories, and second one was the war and peace. So what we did was that we created an Azure AI search service with these two files as a source from our Fabric Lakehouse. Then we created an index and then an indexer that pushes the data from the source to the index in a vectorized form. And then we created a knowledge source based on the index, and finally created a knowledge base based on the knowledge source on which the end user would execute his user queries. So conceptually in Azure AI Search, the idea is pretty simple. So you have the data source, then you have the indexer, then you have the index, then you have the knowledge source that is based upon this index, then you have the knowledge base that is dependent on the knowledge source, and finally you have the user query that can be queried through this UI. So in this video we'll see on how to perform the knowledge retrieval through REST APIs, because we do not want the end user, because we want the end user to have a better user experience rather than forcing him to understand the intricacies of navigating the Azure portal. So what we can do is that we can query the knowledge source through a REST APIs, again the replies as the responses. So what you see on the screen is the sample of the request URL of the knowledge base for an Azure AI search service. So if you look at the URL of the request, it looks more or less like an OData like syntax with parentheses for the knowledge base. So the first part of the URL requires an endpoint, which in our case would be the Azure AI search endpoint. And then you have the knowledge base name, and then you have the API versions. So there are a few older APIs, but we'll use the latest API, which is 25.11.01. All right, so there are a lot of other operations also that could be performed, like you can get a list of indexes, create, delete the indexes. Same for the knowledge base, you can create list or delete or update indexes. But in this video, we'll focus on how to query the knowledge base through these REST APIs. Okay, to get started, we have to first authenticate the request. Now, this can be done through an API keys or through the bearer tokens through service principal. But as you know, I'm not that big of a fan of using API keys or client secret keys. So this solution is implemented through bearer tokens through service principal. So what I did was that I created a service principal and I granted two API permissions to it. So this is the service principal that I created. So the first one being the cognitive search permission, and second one being the machine learning service permissions. Just show that to you. So I have granted the cognitive search permission and the machine learning services permissions. Apart from this, you'll have to grant the user ID through which you're going to authenticate and create the access token, the search index data reader permissions for the search service. So to do that, you can go to access control, and then go to role assignments. So again, as you can see here, I've granted my user ID, the search index data reader permission, because I'll be using my user credentials to create an access token through this service principal Azure AI search. So, and apart from this, you'll have to grant the service principal some level of access to the Azure OpenAI service. So go to access control, and here you'll have to grant the cognitive services permissions to the service principal. So if you recall from a previous video, I had granted the user managed identity, as you can see here, I have granted the cognitive services OpenAI contributor permission to the user managed identities, and here I have granted the cognitive services OpenAI user permissions to the Azure AI Search service principal. So it can be either of two, like you can either grant a contributor or user, but I have granted the user permissions to the Azure AI Search uh, service principal. Like let's get back to our REST API. Okay, let's look at the sample request body. So the first part of the sample request will be the message part. Here you have two options. One is the role, not options, two properties. One being the role and second being the content. So content has two properties. First being the text, which can be a user text or a instruction text, or and second being the type, whether it's a text or an image or something similar. And then you have the max runtime seconds, which is the how long the request should run. And then you have the max output size. The default value is 100,000. Then you have the retrieval reasoning effort, and with the value being set to low. So this option is available in the UI portal as well. So here if you look, so retrieval reasoning effort, so you have that option here: reasoning effort, medium, low, and minimal. So these are the three options. So here they have used the low. Include activity. So basically include activity means setting the value to true means the response will include the token spent to process a request across each step and the total elapsed time. And the output mode, so we have two output modes. One is the answer synthesis and second is the extractive data. So that option is available on the UI as well. And then you have the knowledge source params. So first being the filter, if you need any filter for the request, filter to be applied in the request. Then you have the knowledge source name, the name of the knowledge source, that knowledge source that you want to use. Like for any given knowledge base there can be multiple knowledge sources, so you have to specify which knowledge source you want to use. Include references, whether you want to include references in your response, like from where the responses were extracted from, what context was used to generate the response, and whether you want to include the source data as well. And then you have the kind equal to search index. So since we already have an index created, like here we already have the index in our search service, so we are going to use the search index. We are going to set this value to search index. And if you have a blog, if you have SharePoint, you can like set them based on your underlying index. Okay, let's go to the code here. So as you can see here in the app settings, I'm not using any modern deployment endpoints. So this is going to be a purely post to the, it's going to be a simple post with the body to the REST APIs. And let me open this messages. So yeah, so here what I've done is that I've constructed the post request, the classes for the post request. So first is being the messages. What I'll do is that I'll just like minimize, like resize this so that easy to understand. Yeah. So the messages has two parts. One is the role and second is the content. And the role can be either user or system. The content has two properties, one being text and second being type. The text is like any specific instructions or a user input data, and second being the type, whether it's a text or an image or something like that. And then you have the max runtime in seconds. So we have the max runtime in seconds here. Then you have the max output size. We have the max output size here. Then you have the retrieval reasoning effort. Retrieval reasoning effort value being a string. A kind equal to low. So I have mentioned a property called as a kind here. And then you have the knowledge source params. So I have a class called as a knowledge source params with these properties: filter, add on, knowledge source name, kind, and include references. Since this being an array in the messages class, I have that as an array. And same is the case with the messages part as well. So since content being an array, so what I've done in the messages, I have a content as a list. Right. And then we'll go to the authentication. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm using the Microsoft Security Authentication Library. So I'm using a public client application builder class to generate the user token, authenticate and generate the user access token, and the client ID being this. So client ID is the client ID of the service principal, which is this 0374FACC, and the scope being search.azure.com. And then we'll go to the program.cs. So here is where I've constructed the response body for the post request. So first being the content part. So the first part of the content is a instruction to the is an instruction. So it has type equal to text, and text being this, like you can answer questions about the stories in the source. And second being the user content, being the type being text and the user input. And then the retrieval reasoning effort I've set it to medium. Then the output mode is answer synthesis. I have not changed this. I kept it to default, that is 60 seconds and 100,000 max output size. Then the knowledge source params. So name of the knowledge source is, so if you look here, the name of the knowledge is literature knowledge source. So I have used that here. And then the kind being the search index, which I explained earlier, the search index. And then we don't want any references in our output, so we have set that to false. And another thing, I think I missed that part. Yeah, include activity, like I explained earlier, like what include activity means. So I'll just repeat that quickly. So setting this value to true means that your response will include the total token spent to process the request across each step, and the elapsed time across each step. All right, I'll show that sample response with this value being set to true. Yeah, as you can see, so this is the input tokens, the output tokens, and the elapsed time in milliseconds. All right, so what I'll do is I'll execute this code, and then we'll run a few user queries both on the portal as well as through this REST APIs. Okay, so this is our UI. So here, so there's a character in the underlying source. I think this character exists in like War and Peace. So there's a character called as a Prince Andrew. So I'll just ask this: who was Prince Andrew? Let's query this. So now, since this being our first request, so the code is going to prompt for a user credentials, because uh, user credential to generate the access token. So now the access token is generated. So this is searching for the answers. So there's the answer, and then this is the token cost. Yeah. So let me explain a bit of detail about the serialization and the deserialization processes that I've used. So for serialization, what I've done is that I've used the inbuilt C# serialization library, and for deserialization I've used Newtonsoft, because I personally, for me, for deserializing request is much more easier to Newtonsoft. So I use Newtonsoft for deserialization, and for the output I use spectre.console, because spectre.console gives a more richer output into your console application, as you can see on the screen here. So it has a great utility called as a table. So you can create tables in your console output. So what I've done is that I've used the response for the tokens, like so you get these responses, right? The token values in the response. So I use that to display it in a more tabular format. So for this particular query, user query, the number of input tokens for this operation was 150144, and elapsed time was 2000 millisecond. And for second step of the same operation, it was this many tokens, and elapsed time was this, and answer synthesis, it was this. Now what we'll do is that we'll enter the same user query in the Azure portal as well. So what will happen here is that we will get the responses in the similar context, but the wordings will be different. Like here we have the answer. So Prince Andrew, known as Prince Andrew Bolonsky, is depicted. Okay, here in this case we got almost the similar text. Yeah, we got the similar text, but sometimes it happens that we get a where the context remains the same, but the wordings of the responses, they vary. Okay, I think I said that too early. Let me check if the general Kuduzov is mentioned here. Yeah, okay, it is mentioned. And whether Pierre for his strength and will, Pierre. Okay, that is not mentioned here. I guess Pierre is not mentioned. Yeah, that's what I was saying. That usually the wordings change, but the context all more or less stays the same. All right, so there's another character called as a Rostov. So I'll just paste this query and ask like, who was Rostov? Was Rostov? So since the access token is already generated, it's not gonna reprompt for a user ID, user credential. So since we already have the access token, so yeah, so Rostov refers to Ilya Rostov father, and so yeah, in this case the input tokens were 1500, output tokens of 443, 6397, 263. What I'll do is that we'll just paste the same question here. Was Rostov? Okay, refers to Count Ilya Rostov and his son Nicholas. Ilya Rostov, his father, married to Natalie Shinshina. Okay, okay, Shinshina is not mentioned here, but the father is mentioned here, Ilya Rostov. All right, so in the next, I'll ask something more like an incident from one of those stories. So there was this incident called "What Happened at Kensington Station." So I'll pose this same question here. Okay, it says the man's body was found early morning in a deep excavation near East Kensington Station. The excavation was one of the yeah. So let's see what is the response here. Due to misunderstanding, okay, this part is missing there. Due to misunderstanding between the two workers, the doorway was left unfastened. Unfastened. Okay, it is mentioned, but the wordings are a bit different, but the context remains the same. All right, so that's about it for this video. I hope this video helped you understand like how you can post the request to the retrieval service through REST APIs, and what are the different components of the responses, and how you can use those responses to get more insights. The request, the properties in the for the request is more deep and more detailed. I mean, I've just touched like at the higher level. Like if you look at there are intents, and then you have all these definitions and properties. All right, so that's about it for this video. Okay, if you do have any questions or feedback or comments, do let me know. Okay, thank you very much.